see. Okay, so inside of Maya, I've got basically my mesh loaded, and I've got a normal map loaded as well. So that's basically loaded into a blend. And if you hit 6, you'll be able to see that with the texture detail. So you want to basically select your mesh, go to File, Export Selection, and you should have an FBX option. I will show you in a second here. If you don't have the FBX option, you have to go to Windows, Settings and Preferences, and then go to the Plugin Manager.
Do the maps have to be loaded onto it?
They don't have to be loaded. You can actually save that for Unreal, but sometimes what happens is the linkages remain when you just bring in your assets. And then you want to basically make sure your FBX is loaded and auto-loaded if you want it to load every time. And I usually just turn on the game Fbx Exporter as well. If we go to File, Export Selection. I've already got this set up, so I've got my scenes folder. I'm going to export an FBX. You can tell it to export smoothing groups. And you can also tell it to maybe export these normals. I usually don't necessarily worry too much about it. This will basically auto smooth your entire mesh. So if there's certain edges you want to see have a pure sharp, they may get auto smooth. So you can, again, decide to turn that off or on. And then I'll just replace my object there. So one other issue, like I said, if you're looking at just the mesh on its own without any normal map, you may need to go into Mesh Display and either do a Soften Edge or Soften Harden, or Harden Edge where you think you might need that. So I'm going to go into the Documents Unreal Projects folder, and I'm going to just grab my exported file. The other thing I'll mention too is I generally like tips for rendering inside of Maya with Arnold, but those things don't necessarily carry over to Unreal. So you will want to grab or convert your image to a TGA from a TIFF. If you have TIFFs, then convert them to TGAs. Photoshop is fine, yeah. So I'm going to copy my assets just for now into the default Unreal Projects folder. I'm going to delete the project that was there from earlier. Or maybe I'll just leave it. I'll create a new one.
Where do you access that folder?
So it's just under your Documents and then Unreal Projects. Well, what you'll have to do is open up Unreal Editor and make sure it's up to date, and you'll have to launch it. So first time you launch, it'll probably ask you to connect or log in or create a login via your Facebook or Google. I think you can even use PlayStation, Xbox accounts, like other accounts. So you'll have to actually launch it and associate yourself with Unreal. Yeah, Unreal Engine. So you actually have to go into Epic. It's called Epic Game Launcher. So it looks basically like this. So yeah, basically if you're looking at it, you're going to see the Epic Launcher, and you want to go to Library. So in my case, it crashed, I think. Yeah, let's just bring it over here. So you should see something like version 4.23. I've updated mine to 4.231. There's even a new beta, which actually now has Quixel Mixer in it, which is kind of cool. I don't think it's quite in this release yet, but it's coming very soon. So once you launch Unreal Engine, or the editor, Unreal Editor, I should say, you'll get basically a project window. So I believe the default is to have some starter content. That starter content basically includes a couple kind of sci-fi chairs, I think like a sci-fi table, and then I think maybe a plant. But in this case, we want to provide the content. We're not going to basically use the default content. The only thing that'll stay is kind of this default gray plane, the basic light or sun system. So I'm going to call this Turntable. And then I'll say create project. So desktop is fine, maximum quality, no starter content, and blank is what we want. Okay, so now by default, if you Alt left click and drag, Alt left click and drag is basically just like your Maya. Alt middle mouse click and drag, also pans like Maya, and Alt right click and drag is a zoom. The middle mouse click and drag is weird. It actually is opposite. So if you drag to the right, it goes left. If you drag to the left, it goes right. So you may want to change that preference. If you go into Edit, Editor Preferences, you'll see a section called Viewports. And it's an option right here called Invert Middle Mouse Pan. So you just want to activate that option, and then you can close that. And so now when you hold Alt middle mouse click and drag, when you drag to the right, it actually goes right, left goes left. So right now we basically have a blank project. So there's no content, there's no assets in the project. So if I go into the content browser as well, again, it's basically an empty shell. So remember what I said, I kind of dragged my 2 files into the root Unreal projects. Now if I'm going to cut these, go to my project and go to Turntable, and then again, there's a content folder. You want to put generally all your assets into the content folder. Now, once it detects that, it'll actually ask you if you want to import those objects. And you can basically say, don't ask again, import. So anytime anything goes into that folder, it'll automatically import the assets. Now, another interesting thing, my asset was created in ZBrush, and it was created kind of in that standard 2 centimeter size scale. I don't think I fixed it in Maya. And another issue is that the pivot point, I'll mention the pivot point in a second, is also very important. So I'm going to drag this thing out. And again, it's going to be very, very tiny. Just like Maya, you can hit F, which will focus on your object. So you can see it's really, really tiny. So I have a tendency to just, if I've just been doing ZBrush stuff and haven't paid attention to my scale, I can just scale it up manually inside of Unreal. Now, the one thing I prefer is to set my pivot at the base of the object, dead center, which will give you really, really good results in terms of your turntable, right? It'll rotate in a nice kind of fluid way. So I'll show you this very quickly. So let's say you have an object. We'll pretend this is your model, and it's somewhere off in space. I prefer to use the bonus tools for this. So if you go to bonus tools, which you can download for free online, modify, 0, pivot tools, and then there's something called move pivot to base and 0. So it's kind of essentially setting the pivot to the dead center and the very bottom part of the mesh. So I'll hit that, and you see that updates. My file into the scene. So what I basically want to do, by the way, be careful. If you're Alt rotating, you will accidentally create a copy. Same thing if you, I believe, Alt move. So when you're Alt dragging around, just be careful to not kind of hit that object. But yeah, as I said, what I generally like to do is center my pivot, put it to the base, and then if I'm going to export something, I'll zero out the pivots there. So it's kind of dead center of the world. I think that helps with the cleaner import, gives you less issues, less errors. And again, so this thing should be resting just on the ground nicely. So this is basically your content browser. Like I said, it has kind of a base material that it applies to this object. So if we want to sort of set up the appearance of the object, you have to double click on the material. If I just move this out of the way, this is a node-based editor. And I'll full screen this for a second. So you get a bit of a preview here. And what you can do is double click on this color swatch. So if you do want to make this thing a little darker, I tend to make things a little bit kind of on the blue side, a dark kind of blue-gray. That's great. You basically double click that, it assigns it. Now if you want to apply just, let's say, a reflectivity. So this reflectivity is sort of split between specularity, which is basically light source reflections, and roughness, which is basically overall reflections of the environment. If you drag out a roughness, you basically get a bunch of node options, which you can also access here. So if you found your option here, you can drag it out and connect it. So that's basically 2 different ways to do the same thing. I'll drag out roughness, and when you want just a standard color value, you want something called constant 3 vector. So if you type out constant or constant 3, you'll see that show up in the list, and then it's connected. So if you take a look, a black value gives you almost like a chrome reflective surface, and if you set it to white, it'll be almost like a very kind of micro rough surface. If you go somewhere between, you'll have kind of these blurry, soft reflections, which can be kind of nice. So maybe I'll go somewhere in the dark gray zone. Yeah.
There's another node that's simpler. It's literally just scalar parameter. And
Oh, yeah.
A value from 0 to 1, and 0 is what in black is.
Right.
1 is black, and it's
Yeah.
0.5 or something.
Yeah, what's interesting about this though is like if you decide to tint the reflection, you know, you could sort of play around with that aspect. I'm not actually sure if it's going to do it in roughness, but I believe if I connect it to something like spec, then we'll have, yeah, maybe it's not going to work. Sorry, let me just alt click on this for a sec. Yeah, one of these values, because sometimes I'll just clone the value in, right? So it's going to use the grayscale value of the slider, but still give me a color value input. Well, that's, yeah, it's good to know, right? Scalar, sorry, it was scalar value 2. So it's in the list here. Yeah, I'm not really sure. Yeah, I guess there's a default value, but so I'm going to plug this thing back in, and I'll just take out the color on this because I don't really need it anyways. Okay, so just make sure I'm recording. So the last kind of part to this is actually to load in a normal map. Now, if you have texture maps too, you can load them the same way by adding the same node. It's called a texture sample node. So you'll have to type in texture space sample, and you'll see it's this node right here, texture sample. So click on this. So again, if you're not seeing the texture in here, it's going to come up empty, but you will have to click on the none box there and find your texture. It should be easy since it's the only texture loaded. If you have a diffuse texture, an ambient occlusion texture, you can load those in as well. I'm going to just simply click on my normal map, and this should load. Now, if I minimize this, it may not appear yet. So typically what you have to do, let me just bring this down. If you hit save, or if you close, it'll ask you to save. It's going to update the material, and then we will see it applied to the surface, right? Now, there are a few things I should mention too before we kind of go any further. I'm going to go into Edit and go to Project Settings. So there's some crucial things before we move into animation, basically, setting up a camera. So I'm going to go to Project Settings. And if you type in frame, there is smooth frame rate. I'm going to say I want to use a fixed frame rate under the frame rate option. So I want to use fixed frame rate. I'm picking 24 frames a second. And again, default time code frame rate. So this is actually for animation purposes. I find you also want to sync this up too. It's important to try to do this before I think you start getting into camera animation, because I've noticed there's been some weird quirks when I try to render and things like that. So I'll set that up. There's also something else. We have in Unreal, there's something called post processes. So if you type in POST, that top bar is basically a quick search for, to help you filter through all the features. So if you turn off or disable post processes, this should help prevent things like unwanted motion blur, maybe depth of field that you don't necessarily want to enable or turn on. Okay, so if you wanted to, I'm not going to get into custom lighting, but just to mention, we do have basically a light inside of Unreal by default. This is basically it's equivalent to Maya's direct lights. Direct lights essentially really only operate on kind of rotational angles. So it's even if you move it, it's not going to change the spotlight. It's basically acting like a giant sunlight. So the rotation is kind of the primary way to affect the shadows, the highlights. If you wanted to add additional lights, you can, or maybe disable that light. You just go to lights on the left-hand side, and you can drag out point lights, right? I'm not going to keep them in the scene. You can also drag out a spotlight again, so you can kind of adjust where it's focused, right? And then, of course, you can play with things like the intensity and things like that. For now, like I said, I'm just going to stick with the daylight system. So the next step is I'm going to just simply click on my mesh and hit F to frame it. So that's, again, very much like Maya. Before I do that, though, I should actually make sure my location for the object is centered in the world. So I'm going to set it to 0 on X, and I believe 0 on Y. There we go. So that's nice and centered. So again, I'll hit F to frame this. And now I should be ready to basically move into my cinematics. So the cinematics, you have to basically create what's known as a level sequence. So you go to cinematics, add level sequence. So again, you can label it whatever you want. I usually just call it something like cam, turntable, and then sequence. Turntable. So right now you basically have an empty cinematic sequencer. So it's kind of like an editing / timeline animation editor. Again, we want to make sure our frame rate right now is at 24 frames a second. So that's pretty important. If you want to create a scene camera, you're going to say create new camera and set it as the current camera. So if I click on it, you see you get this scene camera, right? Now you do still kind of have this depth of field thing going on. I'll show you a couple different ways to adjust that. So if you want to get back into, let's say, your viewport camera, you simply click on this little icon on the Cin Camera Actor. So that puts you into the view of what you're going to be rendering. And when you click on this again, it takes you out of that render view, so you can kind of freely render around, and you can make adjustments to that camera if you wanted to in the viewport. So again, I usually like to make sure my camera is pretty cleanly lined up. So I'm going to just click on this again. And I'm going to probably zero out the Y. The Z is okay. I can move it up and down. And the X is going to probably, in this case, bring me further or closer. So I basically want to try to frame this so I can see the object ultimately in full rotation. So I want to frame it nicely so I'm not cutting anything off when I get to the render. So I do want to fill the frame with that object as much as I can. And by the way, if you have something long like a sword or an axe or something, lay it out horizontally so we get to fill the frame with more of that object, and we're not wasting pixels just seeing this, vertical, skinny little object. So that's not so bad. So the first thing is right now the autofocus is on, and that's based partially on the camera aperture. If you just crank this up, you'll basically get full sharpness in the scene, so there won't be that sort of depth of field effect. You may also additionally need to, actually it's telling me too, I think when I change my project settings, it wants to apply the disabling of post-processing. So if I restart now, I have to save everything out. When you save for the first time too, it's going to ask you to save a level sequence. Basically the level is what you see in the scene right now with the assets imported. So I'm going to just hit save on that. I'll leave it as untitled for now. It's going to reboot. So if you're reopening a project, it can be a little bit scary because it may look blank, but if you double click on right now this is my untitled level, it should restore everything back to the way it was. So also just double click on my cam sequence to reload that. Again, if I click on that camera, I'll be back in that sort of camera view. Oh, there's one other setting too I think I missed in project settings. It is the exposure setting. Auto exposure. You can basically just leave this on manual or turn off auto exposure altogether. So what I've seen happen before the turntable is that as the turntable starts, it sort of it almost like changes the level of it's like a camera just seeing sunlight for the first time with auto exposure. So it'll go from like bright to dark or dark to bright, and then it does something else at the end of the clip similarly. So when you see the turntable, it might kind of flicker a bit. So turning off auto exposure will help avoid that issue. Okay, so I think the framing is okay. Next up, I just want to set up the timeline. So I'm going to expand my view range, similar to Maya, right? I'll set it to maybe something like 250, which should be all right. And I'll set this little slider out to 240. So I'm going to do a 10-second, 240 frame turntable. This, by the way, this little kind of slider here, this camera cuts, this is basically the amount of time this camera is visible in the sequencer. So it's basically like a video track in Premiere. You can also set it to be a bit longer. I think sometimes it can be a little bit helpful to make sure that you've got what would be known as head and tail room. We're ultimately not going to render that part of the sequence out, but it's, again, just to avoid any potential glitches, I find this is a good way to handle it. So ultimately, we'll be animating a single turn from 0 to 240. Now, you can animate the camera. I actually found it a little bit easier actually to just rotate our object. So I'm going to right-click in the sequencer. So in some empty space below the camera, right-click and go to Add Actor or Actor to Sequence. And you simply pick your mesh prop. So click on that. Not necessarily. Like everything that's in the scene is visible, but what it allows me to do now is actually animate this. So yeah, basically by adding this, I'm now essentially allowing myself to animate it. So what I'm going to do is go into transform. Yeah, these things are a little bit weird, but just through trial and error, like this thing is rotated 90 degrees already to kind of align the lighting of Unreal a little better. So what I'm going to do, while I'm on frame 0, let me just make sure I'm on frame 0 there with the time slider. Set this to 0, and if you hit the little plus sign, it's going to keyframe that. If we scrub to the end, or if you simply, I find it, again, a little better to jump to 240 exactly, and then hit, this is the yaw. Instead of XYZ rotation, you see roll, pitch, and yaw. So hit 360, hit enter, and it should key the end there. Now, one problem with this, by the way, if you want to see this play back and a loop, you want to go to the bottom of this sequencer, turn on looping, and then you simply hit the play button, and we'll get a reasonable playback of our object. Now, there's one issue. Again, for professional turntables, it's better to not have a slow in and slow out on the animation. So I'm going to pause that. The way to fix this is to actually go into the curve editor. There's a little curve editor inside of Unreal. So if you click on that, and then we have to, again, locate our rotation. So I'll select the yaw, select both keys. So it's just left clicking and dragging. And then I'll set this to linear. So you should get a nice sort of steady, constant rotation. Okay, so I'm going to just stop that for now. There's a couple of other little fixes I want to do before I feel kind of ready to move on to rendering. So I'll just move this back here for a sec. One issue is, your objects are probably going to be solid, but if you do happen to have an object that's maybe is hollow on a certain side, you can double click on the material. And if you scroll down into the material settings, you'll see something called two-sided. And by the way, when I first started my editor open, this one was really small, so I just had to scale it up by left clicking and dragging that sort of sidebar. So I'll turn on two-sided, close this up, hit yes to save, and it should take a second, but now it's going to load properly. A couple other issues. When you have lighting, and if you make lighting changes, you can sort of see in here, I've got this little red warning. It says basically, please build or rebuild lighting. So if you ever add lights, change the light settings, change shadow settings, anything like that, you want to go into build and say build lighting only. So there's a shortcut there, which is Control-Shift semicolon. So what it does is it's kind of pre-calculating the lighting and updating it so you get a more accurate response from the sequencer, right? Basically, the lighting in a game engine is not totally realistic like Arnold, or even like Viewport 2.0 has more realism to some degree than Unreal might. So, like I said, just make sure you go into build, build lighting only. And if your object is hollow, just go into two-sided to turn that on. Okay, so I think I need to double check. So if I look at the turn, I feel like it's cutting off at the bottom a little bit, and there's quite a bit of room at the top. So I'm going to probably just select my camera and just adjust its Z height here a bit there. So again, I'll kind of scrub through just to make sure everything turns okay. I think it looks pretty good. Yeah, it seems all right. Okay, so I'm going to make sure I save this. I'm going to close this for a sec. You can go to File, Save All. Yes.
Since it's not for
Well, that is interesting. Yes, cool. So you can go to Settings. Yes, Project Settings. Sorry, Settings, and where do we go here? Engine Scalable Settings, Cinematic. Nice. Okay, cool. So let me just, again, I want to double check framing and everything. So I'm going to go into the sequence editor one more time and turn on my sequence camera. There we go. So one of the final steps is to really go into the settings of the renderer. So if you click on this little clapper, film clapper icon, we're going to set AVI is fine. I usually set the resolution to my max HD, full HD. For video compression, I will set it to, again, 100%. For the output, you can just leave it on default if you want, or give the file a name. Also, if you expand the setting a little bit, there is an option here for Overwrite Existing. So if you're having to recalculate the turntable, that'll help just avoid you from ballooning up your render folder. I'm going to just turn up these as well. I find I don't really need these two sequence sort of trackers. And then under animation, I found this actually very important. So I'm going to set the start time. Because this is a 10-second loop, the first and last frame are exactly the same, right? So frame 000 and 360 will wind up in the same position. So I find it good to basically set your start time to frame 1. So I want to make sure these will start and end exactly where I want them to. So I like to enter these numbers manually. So 001 and then 240 for the end frame. For the warm-up frame count, you can set it to something like 2 or 5. I noticed too, what sometimes happens, and apparently it's been an issue in Unreal for quite a while, is that if your objects are in a different location and your cinematic sequence is happening somewhere else in the world, you may see motion blur as they jump into the location. So this actually avoids that little glitch, or if you see some weird blurring effect, that will help avoid that. I'll do the same thing, delay warm-up before warm-up and delay before warm-up shot. I'll set it to 0.2 seconds for both of these. Again, I find it just helps to avoid any weird kind of glitches for the most part in your sequence. So I'll go to Capture Movie, and it's going to output. One last thing I actually forgot to do is to simply apply a new material, kind of taking out the checker of the floor. I'm okay if you leave it in, but for my personal aesthetic, I would probably take it out. Okay, so this thing should have rendered out. So I'm going to go into the saved folder under the Turntable project, under video captures, and we should see pretty decent footage of a turntable. So if all goes well, there should be no major glitching. Everything should look good for the most part. And there you go. As a final step, I would say, because the file size is a little bit on the heavy side, it's probably okay for Moodle, but if you wanted to recompress it or compress it down a little bit, you can always drag it into Media Encoder. And very simply just use the H.264 high bitrate setting. You should get a very good result in a very small file size. I find it useful to have access to something like this. So yeah, I usually just kind of drag it right into the queue window, and then I'll click on the settings, H.264, match source, high bitrate. There's no audio, so you can just uncheck export audio. And then we'll hit OK and hit the little play icon, and you should get an emailable version of your file, which is great when you have, let's say, client work that you want to send along to somebody else. So 11 megabytes, and it should look, like I said, practically the same. I think that's about it. It's a lot of little steps, but for the most part, you should get a pretty good result. trying to remember the name of the software I was using before. Does everybody have Media Encoder at home? Some people don't. Oh yeah, it's Handbrake. That's the one. Does anybody ever use Handbrake?
Oh, yeah, I do.
Okay, so yeah, just to make sure. Yeah, if you don't have Media Encoder at home, just find a program called Handbrake, and you can literally drag and drop your folder into, or your AVI into there, and it basically does the same thing that Media Encoder does. It's just free. So, and again, it's got presets that you can kind of load up as well. Okay. Now that is the last props lecture. So this project, like I said, is pretty much like a bonus.